The summer of 1944 marked the decisive, irreversible phase of the Pacific War. Having successfully executed the long, brutal campaigns of island hopping, the Allied focus now locked onto the Mariana Islands, a chain of strategic importance so immense that their seizure was viewed as the necessary, non-negotiable step for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. At the heart of this chain lay Saipan, a volcanic rock of just 46 square miles, which the Japanese had transformed over decades into an intricate, self-sustaining military fortress, a symbol of the immense defensive depth of the empire. The capture of Saipan would place American B-29 superfortress bombers within striking distance of Tokyo, marking the end of the defensive perimeter that had protected the Japanese homeland. The Japanese Imperial High Command understood the absolute strategic value of Saipan. They had committed an immense garrison, over 30,000 highly disciplined troops, including both Imperial Army and Naval Landing Force units, to its defense. The commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, was under fanatical orders. The island was to be defended to the last man. The defenses were massive, layered, and designed for maximum attrition. The beaches were protected by elaborate systems of underwater obstacles, dense minefields, and interlocking fire from heavy machine guns and concealed anti-tank guns. Inland, the rugged volcanic terrain was utilized to the maximum, with caves, ravines, and fortified pillboxes turning every ridge into a death trap. The Japanese strategy was simple and brutal: inflict such catastrophic casualties on the invading American forces that the political will of the United States to continue the offensive would be broken, forcing a negotiated settlement. The invasion force committed by the Americans was equally colossal, a massive mobilization of naval and amphibious power designed to guarantee the success of the assault. The landing was spearheaded by the elite U.S. Marine Corps, specifically the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, supported by the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division. The operation was a massive logistical feat, requiring the coordination of hundreds of vessels, immense air and naval bombardment, and the continuous supply of thousands of men across the vast distances of the Pacific. The Marines, veterans of the brutal campaigns on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, knew that Saipan would be the toughest fight yet, a profound test of American endurance against the fanatical defense. The preliminary phase of the invasion was defined by a massive naval and aerial bombardment designed to neutralize the formidable coastal defenses. Battleships, cruisers, and carrier aircraft poured thousands of tons of high explosives onto the island, aiming to suppress the coastal batteries and clear the approach beaches. Yet the Japanese defensive genius shone through. Many of their key defensive positions were concealed and fortified deep inland, protected by the rugged terrain and the thick concrete of their pillboxes, designed to survive sustained bombardment and emerge ready to meet the landing force. The stage was set for a direct, bloody confrontation between the overwhelming material power of the American system and the fanatical, entrenched defense of the Japanese Imperial Army. The invasion of Saipan was not merely a battle. It was the symbolic, strategic collision that defined the trajectory of the final Pacific campaign. The invasion of Saipan commenced at dawn on June 15, 1944. The initial hours of the landing were a chaotic, terrifying firestorm, a brutal confirmation of the defensive depth that the Japanese had engineered. The Marines, pouring out of the landing craft and onto the assigned beaches, codenamed Green, Red, Blue, and Yellow, were immediately caught in a crossfire of concentrated Japanese steel that transformed the sandy shoreline into a vast, open killing zone. The meticulously planned Japanese defense, designed to inflict maximum casualties in the critical moments of the landing, was executed with precision and devastating effect. The American plan, relying on the naval bombardment to neutralize the primary defenses, was immediately challenged by the Japanese tenacity. The Japanese coastal defenses, though battered, emerged from their deep shelters ready to fire. Machine guns, mortars, and carefully zeroed-in artillery poured a relentless, continuous barrage onto the beaches and the approaching landing craft. The noise was deafening, the air thick with smoke, pulverized sand, and shrapnel. The Marines, many of whom were seeing their first action, found themselves pinned down near the waterline, forced to crawl forward under continuous, concentrated enemy fire. The initial progress was agonizingly slow, paid for by immense, immediate casualties. The crucial battle in the first hour was fought over the beach exits. The Japanese commanders had correctly identified the narrow, defined exits as the non-negotiable weak points of the American plan. Anti-tank guns and concealed machine gun nests, placed to provide interlocking fire, systematically targeted the vehicles, attempting to breach the seawalls and the lines of advancing infantry. The battlefield quickly became a maze of burning vehicles, shattered landing craft, and the growing, tragic lines of casualties, placing immense strain on the assault engineers tasked with clearing the obstacles and opening the critical routes inland. Despite the shocking ferocity of the initial defense, the overwhelming material superiority of the American forces began to assert itself. The sheer volume of troops committed to the assault, the continuous fire support provided by the naval vessels lying just offshore, and the disciplined execution of the advance, even under heavy fire, guaranteed that the Japanese could not completely stop the landing. The Marines, relying on specialized demolition teams and the immediate application of suppressive fire, systematically reduced the strongpoints one by one, slowly widening the perimeter and securing the essential foothold. The cost was immense, but the foothold was established. By nightfall of D-Day, the American forces had secured a tenuous beachhead, roughly 10,000 yards wide and about a mile deep, anchored by the sacrifice of over 2,000 casualties. The cost was high, but the Marines were ashore, and the critical logistical flow had begun. Saipan, by midnight, was no longer a Japanese fortress. It was a contested, burning landscape, transformed into a maze of fire, sand, and steel by the sheer destructive force of the greatest amphibious landing yet seen in the Pacific. Attention! Forward assault waves. You've just hit the toughest beach in the Pacific, where the enemy fought to the death for every meter of sand. If the brutal shock and the immense cost of the Saipan landing resonate with your understanding of the war's non-negotiable costs, then do not let this strategic memory fade. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the records of these critical island battles. And here is your tactical query. Was the high initial casualty rate primarily caused by the lack of sufficient naval fire, or the Japanese reliance on concealed inland defenses? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the historical debate define the cost of the breakthrough. With the beachhead tenuously secured, the battle for Saipan immediately shifted from the coastal sands to the unforgiving, rugged interior, a landscape that proved to be even more lethal than the beaches. The geography of the island, a massive concentration of volcanic peaks, deep ravines, and sheer coral cliffs, was utilized by the Japanese to construct a defense in depth that neutralized the American advantages in armor and mobility, forcing the engagement into a series of brutal, close-quarters infantry assaults. The primary defensive structure encountered by the Marines was the cave network. Saipan's porous, volcanic rock was riddled with thousands of natural caves, which the Japanese engineers had systematically expanded, fortified with concrete, and interconnected to serve as hospitals, ammunition dumps, and, most critically, concealed strongpoints. These caves provided the Japanese with perfect cover against American artillery and aerial bombardment, allowing them to emerge to fire and retreat into the earth, forcing the American infantry into the slow, agonizing process of systematic clearance. Every cave was a potential death trap, requiring the specialized use of flamethrowers, demolition charges, and immense infantry courage to neutralize. The advance was further hampered by the immense heat and humidity of the tropical environment, coupled with the rugged, irregular terrain. The Marines were forced to fight uphill, across razor-sharp coral, and through dense cane fields that provided perfect concealment for Japanese snipers and machine gunners. The pace of the advance slowed dramatically, turning the rapid pursuit into a methodical, high-cost process of attrition. The continuous nature of the close-quarters combat placed immense strain on the psychological and physical endurance of the American infantry. who were constantly under threat from an enemy they rarely saw until the moment of the direct encounter. The Japanese strategy in the interior was a direct application of their attritional doctrine: deny the Americans any swift movement, inflict maximum casualties from concealed positions, and force the American command to commit immense, unsustainable resources to clearing the island meter by meter. They utilized every geographical feature to their advantage, placing concealed bunkers on reverse slopes and utilizing the high ground of Mount Tapochau and Purple Heart Ridge to command devastating fields of fire over the American lines. The Americans, having secured the technological and material advantage, were forced to revert to the most basic, brutal form of warfare: the slow, systematic clearance of caves and strong points by small infantry teams. This phase of the battle was characterized by the immense bravery of the demolition teams and the flamethrower operators, who faced the direct, fanatical resistance of the Japanese defenders. The unforgiving interior of Saipan was a profound daily test of American resolve, confirming that the Japanese commitment to the defense in depth would guarantee that the island was taken only at a catastrophic cost. Just as the Marines were fighting their brutal, high-cost battles in the interior of Saipan, the immense strategic importance of the island triggered a massive, decisive confrontation at sea: the Battle of the Philippine Sea, often referred to by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This naval clash was the direct consequence of the Japanese Imperial High Command's desperate, all-or-nothing effort to relieve the island and annihilate the American invasion fleet. The Japanese commitment was total. They deployed their remaining mobile aircraft carrier fleet, commanded by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, in a daring attempt to achieve air superiority over the Marianas, and then launch a decisive strike against the vulnerable American landing force. The American fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, anticipated this reaction and positioned itself to protect the landing force, resulting in a colossal, pivotal confrontation that determined the future control of the Central Pacific. The battle itself was a devastating, one-sided catastrophe for the Japanese. The American forces, benefiting from superior radar technology, highly trained pilots, and the technological resilience of their aircraft carriers, systematically decimated the waves of Japanese air attacks. The engagement was characterized by the immense, continuous destruction of Japanese aircraft, shot down by the massive, coordinated defense of the American fleet. The battle quickly became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the disproportionate losses suffered by the Japanese air arm. The Japanese lost hundreds of aircraft and 3 massive fleet carriers, a loss of naval air power that was functionally irreplaceable. The immediate strategic consequence was the total collapse of the Japanese naval air power as an effective fighting force. The Japanese fleet, stripped of its air cover, was forced into a humiliating terminal retreat, guaranteeing that the American invasion fleet and the forces on Saipan would not face any further serious threat from the Japanese Navy. The battle secured the skies and the seas around Saipan, providing the Marines with the non-negotiable air superiority and naval fire support that would guarantee the eventual success of the ground campaign. The defeat in the Philippine Sea sealed the fate of the Japanese garrison on Saipan. They were now completely isolated, cut off from any hope of reinforcement, resupply, or evacuation. The final battle for the island transitioned from a critical confrontation into a desperate, hopeless siege, confirming that the strategic importance of Saipan had been won not just by the grit of the Marines, but by the overwhelming coordinated superiority of the American naval and air forces. The Imperial High Command's desperate attempt to save Saipan resulted only in the total destruction of its remaining carrier fleet, accelerating the total collapse of the Japanese war effort. Attention, Naval Command! You've just witnessed the pivotal naval clash that sealed the fate of Saipan, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hallyu. The battle was won in the air and on the water. If the strategic consequence of neutralizing the Japanese carrier fleet resonates with your understanding of Pacific warfare, do not let this strategic pivot fade. Subscribe now and commit to preserving the analysis of these monumental naval campaigns. And here is your tactical query. Was the outcome of the Battle of the Philippine Sea more influenced by superior American pilot training or the superior technology of American radar? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the historical debate define naval dominance. The relentless grinding nature of the Saipan campaign, combined with the catastrophic naval defeat, pushed the Japanese garrison into a terminal, irreversible state of collapse, a state characterized by the tragic dissolution of the traditional Bushido code and a final fanatical commitment to mass annihilation. The strategic hopelessness of the siege transformed the Japanese defense from a coordinated military operation into a desperate, disorganized process of self-destruction. The psychological toll on the Japanese garrison was immense. The soldiers, cut off from all hope of rescue and fighting a continuous losing battle against overwhelming American material superiority, were forced to confront the grim reality of their imminent, inevitable end. The traditional code of Bushido, which demanded absolute obedience and prohibited surrender, ensured that the fighting would be a war of extermination. The refusal of the Japanese command to surrender, even when the situation was strategically hopeless, guaranteed that every soldier who survived the initial combat would eventually perish on the island. The relentless attrition and the lack of supplies led to a profound deterioration of discipline. Units became isolated, communication broke down, and soldiers were often forced to forage for food and water, transforming the once disciplined Imperial Army into fragmented groups struggling for survival. The intense, unyielding pressure from the American forces, who systematically applied overwhelming firepower to clear the caves and strongpoints, ensured that the Japanese could not maintain any cohesive, organized defense. The fighting became a desperate, individualistic struggle against the environment, disease, and the relentless pressure of the American advance. The tragic climax of the campaign was the final Banzai Charge, a massive suicidal assault launched by the remnants of the Japanese garrison on July 7, 1944. General Saito, having acknowledged the hopelessness of the situation, gathered the remaining able-bodied men, soldiers, sailors, and even wounded personnel, for a final desperate charge against the American lines. This massive, chaotic human wave, fueled by desperation and a final, rigid adherence to the no-surrender doctrine, was tactically crushed by the overwhelming American firepower. The charge, while inflicting immense shock and localized casualties on the American lines, was quickly and definitively broken, resulting in the total annihilation of the remaining organized Japanese fighting force. The Banzai Charge was the ultimate tragic expression of the collapse of Bushido, a massive, final act of self-destruction that achieved nothing strategically but maximized the casualties of the losing side. The immense loss of life, the almost total annihilation of the entire Japanese garrison, confirmed the immense cost of the island-hopping campaign and the terrible human consequence of the Japanese adherence to a doctrine that permitted no pathway for survival or strategic retreat. You've tracked the siege to its brutal climax, the Banzai Charge, where desperation met overwhelming firepower. The island is secured, but the cost is staggering. If the tragedy and strategic necessity of the Saipan campaign resonate with your mind, do not let the truth be buried in the sand. Subscribe now and commit to honoring the soldiers who paid this immense price. And we need your final intelligence task. Suggest the next great tragedy of the Pacific War, perhaps the battles for Iwo Jima or Okinawa, for our deep dive analysis. Your suggestions guide our strategic mission. The immense military drama of Saipan was tragically compounded by the profound civilian tragedy that unfolded during the final phase of the battle, a humanitarian disaster that forever scarred the memory of the campaign. Saipan was home to a large population of Japanese civilians, including many Okinawans and Koreans who had been brought to the island for labor and commerce. The final collapse of the Japanese defense trapped these civilians in the chaotic, brutal final stages of the fighting, leading to mass suicide and unnecessary slaughter. The tragedy was fueled by pervasive, relentless propaganda. The Japanese military command had systematically instilled a terrifying false narrative in the civilian population, that the conquering American forces were brutal savages who would torture, rape, and murder any civilian who fell into their hands. This fear, coupled with the nationalistic doctrine that viewed capture as a profound shame, led thousands of Japanese civilians to commit mass suicide rather than face the supposed horror of capture. Families jumped from the high cliffs on the northern tip of the island, cliffs that were subsequently and tragically renamed Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff, a grim monument to the power of state-sponsored terror and delusion. The American forces, upon realizing the extent of the civilian tragedy, mounted an immense, immediate humanitarian effort to prevent the mass suicides. Loudspeaker teams broadcast messages in Japanese and Okinawan, promising safety, food, and medical care, attempting to counter the horrific narrative of the Japanese propaganda machine. Marines risked their lives, often operating under enemy fire, to try and pull civilians back from the precipices of the cliffs. The effort saved thousands of lives, but the final tragic image of the civilian suicides remains the most haunting, indelible memory of the campaign. The civilian tragedy was the ultimate, devastating indictment of the moral bankruptcy of the collapsing Japanese regime. The Imperial Command, having failed to protect its people, committed the final, unforgivable sin of actively encouraging their self-destruction, prioritizing the rigid adherence to a perverse code of honor over the sanctity of human life. The immense human cost of the campaign, therefore, was not confined to the military losses. It included the tragic, unnecessary slaughter of thousands of civilians, victims of a propaganda campaign that destroyed the moral foundation of the final defense. The legacy of the civilian tragedy in Saipan remains a somber, crucial reminder of the moral dimension of total war. The desperate final acts of the Japanese military, fueled by terror and delusion, ensured that the liberation of the island was marked by a profound, heartbreaking cost that transcended the battlefield. The Cliffs of Despair stand as the final tragic monument to the immense, devastating human consequence of war, fought to the point of total annihilation. The capture of Saipan was the strategic goal of the entire Central Pacific campaign, and its immense payoff was immediately realized with the construction of massive air bases necessary to house the B-29 superfortress bombers. Saipan and the neighboring islands became the final, non-negotiable springboard for the strategic air war against the Japanese home islands, transforming the trajectory of the final Pacific campaign. The primary strategic consequence was the establishment of continuous air superiority over the Japanese homeland. The B-29, the largest and most technologically advanced bomber of its time, possessed the necessary range and payload capacity to strike Tokyo and the major industrial centers of Japan directly from the Marianas. This placed the Japanese industrial base under continuous, systematic pressure, accelerating the terminal consumption of their war economy and breaking the final protective barrier that had shielded the Japanese homeland from direct attack. The immense logistical effort required to transform Saipan's rugged terrain into massive operational air bases was a final, stunning demonstration of the overwhelming American engineering capacity. Thousands of Seabees, naval construction battalions, and combat engineers worked around the clock, utilizing massive earth-moving equipment and specialized construction techniques to build the immense runways, hangars, and logistical support infrastructure necessary for the B-29 fleet. The speed and scale of this construction, achieving operational status within months of the initial landing, was a profound logistical triumph, ensuring that the strategic payoff of the Saipan victory was realized immediately. The B-29 raids launched from Saipan, followed by the bases on Tinian and Guam, were the final decisive strategic weapon that broke the Japanese will to resist. The continuous large-scale bombing of industrial targets, coupled with the devastating firebombing of major Japanese cities, consumed the remaining capacity of the Japanese war economy, leading to mass shortages of food, fuel, and essential war materials. The strategic air war, sustained by the logistical capacity of the Marianas base, was the ultimate execution of the American material advantage. The legacy of Saipan is that of the B-29 Lifeline, the immense, vital airbases that served as the final operational hub for the total defeat of the Japanese Empire. The immense sacrifice of the Marines and the soldiers in securing the island was the necessary human cost for the strategic liberation of the B-29 fleet. The strategic payoff of Saipan was total, transforming the final phase of the Pacific Campaign from a distant conflict into a direct, systematic assault on the Japanese industrial heartland. The capture and subsequent utilization of Saipan as the B-29 springboard triggered immediate and desperate Japanese counter-efforts, highlighting the strategic importance of the loss. The Japanese Imperial Command, realizing the terminal threat posed by the Marianas bases, committed massive, high-risk resources in a futile attempt to neutralize the B-29 threat and delay the inevitable final assault on the home islands. The primary Japanese counter-effort was the launch of desperate air raids against the newly constructed Marianas air bases. Japanese bomber aircraft, often flying extremely long-range, suicidal missions from distant bases, attempted to inflict damage on the B-29 fleet and the massive logistical infrastructure of Saipan and Tinian. These raids, while occasionally inflicting localized damage, were largely ineffective against the massive American anti-aircraft defenses and the constant overwhelming patrols of the American Air Forces. The Japanese attacks were high-cost and ultimately unsustainable, consuming the last operational reserves of their long-range air power. The Japanese command also implemented a high-risk, desperate strategy utilizing specialized commando and sabotage raids. Small, highly trained Japanese teams, often infiltrating the Marianas Islands via submarine or small watercraft, attempted to inflict damage on the B-29s and the base infrastructure. These missions were characterized by immense personal bravery and fanaticism, but they were largely ineffective against the stringent security measures implemented by the American military. The capture or annihilation of these raiding parties was a constant high-stakes process that consumed additional Japanese human resources. The desperation of the Japanese counter-efforts confirmed the total strategic significance of the Saipan loss. The Japanese High Command realized that the B-29 bases were the terminal strategic threat, the weapon that would ultimately destroy their industrial capacity and break the will of the civilian population. Their high-risk counter-missions were a final futile gesture, consuming the last reserves of their specialized manpower and unique assets in a doomed attempt to delay the inevitable. The American response to these counter-efforts was systematic and overwhelming. The immense logistical capacity of the Marianas bases ensured that any damage inflicted was quickly and efficiently repaired. The massive anti-aircraft and air defense network guaranteed that the Japanese attacks were met with devastating continuous destruction. The strategic situation was irreversible. The Japanese had lost the operational capacity to seriously threaten the B-29 Lifeline, and the strategic air war against the homeland was destined to continue unabated. The price of possession for the Marianas was high, but the strategic payoff in accelerating the end of the war was total. The brutal, high-cost victory on Saipan provided the Allied command with a series of immediate, critical lessons that fundamentally redefined the paradigm of the Pacific War and shaped the final island-hopping campaigns. The unique intensity of the Japanese defense and the logistical challenges of the large-scale landing confirmed the strategic realities that would dictate the final defeat of the Japanese Empire. The primary lesson was the criticality of systematic cave and tunnel clearance. The Japanese reliance on fortified interconnected cave networks provided a defense in depth that neutralized traditional artillery and air power. The battle confirmed that the clearance of these strongpoints required specialized infantry tactics, high-volume firepower, flamethrowers, and demolition expertise, necessitating the permanent integration of specialized teams into the marine assault doctrine. The lessons learned in Saipan were immediately applied to the subsequent campaigns on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, saving thousands of lives. The second lesson was the absolute necessity of material redundancy and logistical depth. The massive size of the Saipan landing confirmed the American capacity to mobilize and sustain a large-scale invasion, but the immense initial casualties demonstrated the need for continuous, robust naval fire support and the immediate rapid construction of logistical infrastructure. The Saipan experience guaranteed that future landings would be preceded by even heavier, more prolonged naval bombardments and the immediate commitment of Seabees battalions to accelerate the construction of logistical hubs. The third lesson was the tragic but necessary recognition of the fanatical nature of the Japanese defense. The commitment to no surrender and the Banzai Charge confirmed that future battles would be wars of extermination, necessitating the systematic destruction of the enemy garrison. This grim reality informed the strategic planning for the final assaults, emphasizing the need for overwhelming firepower and the systematic, methodical reduction of resistance. The tragic mass suicide of the civilians also highlighted the moral imperative to counter Japanese propaganda and prioritize humanitarian efforts in the final stages of the island capture. The legacy of Saipan was the establishment of a new template for victory in the Central Pacific. The high cost of the island was the necessary payment for the ultimate strategic knowledge. The Japanese defense could be broken only by the systematic, continuous application of overwhelming material superiority, highly specialized infantry tactics, and the relentless speed of American logistical buildup. Saipan was the strategic crucible that forged the final, decisive doctrine of the Pacific War. The brutal, high-cost victory on Saipan left an enduring legacy, a final, chilling confirmation of the immense human cost required to breach the final protective barriers of the Japanese Empire. The island, strategically vital and fiercely defended, became a symbol of the desperate, unforgiving nature of the final Pacific campaign. The legacy is rooted in the immense human sacrifice paid by both sides. For the Americans, the thousands of casualties incurred in the landing and the subsequent cave-clearing operations confirmed the fanatical intensity of the Japanese defense. The price of securing the B-29 Lifeline was immense, requiring the commitment of elite Marine and Army forces to a continuous war of attrition against the entrenched, suicidal Japanese garrison. The memory of Saipan stands as a powerful testament to the courage and endurance of the American fighting man. For the Japanese, the legacy is one of total strategic and moral defeat. The near-total annihilation of the 30,000-man garrison, the destruction of the carrier fleet in the Philippine Sea, and the tragic mass suicide of the civilian population confirmed the terminal consequence of their high-risk defense. Saipan was the strategic pivot point that marked the total consumption of their remaining offensive and defensive capacity in the Central Pacific, accelerating the inevitable end of the war. The final enduring memory of Saipan is one of strategic necessity and moral tragedy. The island had to be taken, regardless of the cost, to secure the B-29 Lifeline and guarantee the final victory. But the victory was inextricably linked to the tragic images of Suicide Cliff and the immense human consequence of the Banzai Charge. The legacy remains a somber, crucial reminder that the final victories of a total war are often purchased at a profound, heartbreaking human and ethical cost. The legacy of Saipan cemented the strategic paradigm of the Pacific War. The ultimate determinant of victory was industrial and logistical capacity. The Marines and the soldiers fought and won the battle, but the strategic outcome was dictated by the superior American capacity to sustain the massive invasion, replace losses, and rapidly transform a volcanic rock into the decisive launching pad for the final strategic air war. Saipan was the necessary, costly barrier that, once breached, guaranteed the final total defeat of the Japanese Empire. The military success of the American forces on Saipan and the subsequent strategic utilization of the island was fundamentally reliant on the relentless, often unheralded efforts of the Seabees, naval construction battalions, the logistical backbone that transformed a volcanic battlefield into a massive, functioning airbase. The immense coordinated engineering triumph of the Seabees was the final non-negotiable step that guaranteed the strategic payoff of the costly victory. The primary task of the Seabees was one of immense, immediate difficulty, turning jungle, coral, and broken terrain into operational runways large enough to accommodate the massive B-29 Superfortress bombers. The work began almost immediately after the beachhead was secured, often within range of Japanese artillery and sniper fire, underscoring the lethal environment in which these construction troops operated. The Seabees utilized massive earth-moving equipment, bulldozers, and specialized road graders, working around the clock under immense pressure to clear the debris, level the terrain, and lay down the foundational material for the colossal runways. The logistical challenge was compounded by the remote location and the immense volume of material required. Every piece of heavy machinery, every pound of asphalt, and every specialized component had to be transported thousands of miles across the Pacific, a logistical feat that confirmed the total superiority of the American supply chain. The Seabees not only built the runways, they constructed the entire necessary infrastructure: massive fuel storage tanks, complex water purification systems, immense supply depots, and the entire network of roads necessary to sustain the massive B-29 fleet and the thousands of personnel required to operate it. The strategic consequence of the Seabees' engineering triumph was the immediate realization of the strategic goal. The rapid construction of the airbases ensured that the Japanese High Command had no time to recover or adjust to the new threat. Within months of the initial landing, the first B-29 raids were launched against Tokyo, marking the end of the defensive perimeter that had shielded the Japanese homeland. The speed of the American logistical buildup was a massive, decisive factor in accelerating the terminal collapse of the Japanese war effort. The legacy of the Seabees on Saipan is a powerful testament to the principle that logistics wins wars. The immense bravery of the Marines in securing the island was the necessary precondition, but the strategic victory was ultimately secured by the unparalleled American capacity to sustain the invasion and rapidly transform the conquered territory into a permanent, functional strategic asset. The Seabees were the true, unheralded engine of the final Pacific victory, transforming the deadly volcanic rock into the decisive launching pad for the total defeat of the Japanese Empire. The relentless American advance through the unforgiving interior of Saipan forced the Japanese garrison into a terminal, irreversible attritional spiral, a process characterized by the critical loss of fuel and food, the breakdown of command, and the final fragmentation of the remaining forces. This spiral of depletion and desperation guaranteed that the final defense would be a disorganized, high-cost battle of extermination. The spiral began with the loss of the logistical base. The initial American bombardment and the rapid establishment of the beachhead immediately cut off the Japanese garrison from any hope of resupply, forcing them to rely on their finite internal reserves of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. As the American advance continued, these reserves were either consumed or systematically destroyed, leading to immediate, severe shortages of food and water. The psychological and physical toll of starvation and dehydration further crippled the fighting capacity of the Japanese soldier, eroding discipline and leading to fragmentation. The breakdown of command and control was the second critical element of the spiral. The immense, continuous American artillery fire, coupled with the systemic clearance of communication lines, severed the centralized command structure. Isolated Japanese units were left to fight without coordination, relying on individual instinct and the rigid, often suicidal adherence to local defense. The American forces, conversely, utilized their superior communication and mobility to exploit these isolated units, systematically reducing the resistance strongpoint by strongpoint. The final stage of the spiral was the physical fragmentation of the forces. Depleted of food and under continuous pressure, the Japanese forces abandoned their large, static defensive positions and retreated into the thousands of natural caves and ravines, dispersing into small, isolated groups fighting for survival. This fragmentation, while temporarily complicating the American clearance efforts, guaranteed that the remaining Japanese capacity for organized counterattack was completely neutralized. The intense, high-cost Banzai charge was the last desperate act of the fragmented garrison, an act that only accelerated the final, total annihilation of the remaining forces. The attritional spiral on Saipan confirmed the decisive role of logistical superiority in total war. The American forces did not merely defeat the Japanese in a direct military confrontation. They systematically starved the garrison of the necessary resources, forced the collapse of the command structure, and utilized the superior industrial base to maintain the continuous pressure. The final Japanese defense was a doomed attempt to fight an industrial war without an industrial base, a strategic failure that was sealed by the relentless logistical assault of the American war machine. Attention, rear echelon! You've tracked the enemy through the terminal spiral of attrition, where a lack of food and fuel guaranteed collapse. If the strategic lesson of logistical strangulation resonates with your mind, do not let this critical intelligence be lost. Subscribe now and commit to analyzing the failures that dictate the end of a campaign. And here is your operational query. Did the breakdown of Japanese discipline accelerate more due to the shortage of fresh water or the total failure of centralized command? Drop your strategic assessment in the comments below. Let the historical debate define the cost of strategic isolation. The relentless, methodical American advance through the rugged interior of Saipan was made possible by the overwhelming, systematic application of firepower superiority, the coordinated use of artillery and naval guns that guaranteed the continuous, debilitating pressure on the entrenched Japanese defenders. This massive, sustained barrage was the true destructive engine that broke the formidable Japanese defense in depth. The American assault was preceded and supported by a continuous massive naval bombardment. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers positioned offshore poured thousands of rounds of high-explosive shells onto the island, targeting known and suspected Japanese strongpoints, artillery positions, and command centers. The sheer volume of this naval fire, sustained for days, and continuously adjusted to support the infantry's advance, systematically pulverized the Japanese defenses and inflicted immense, unceasing casualties. The Japanese defenders, entrenched in their caves and pillboxes, were forced to endure a state of perpetual bombardment, eroding their morale and disrupting any attempt at organized counterattack. Inland, the field artillery of the Marine and Army divisions provided the crucial, immediate fire support necessary to clear the hidden strongpoints and repel localized counterattacks. The American artillery, benefiting from superior forward observation and efficient communications, was able to place massive, continuous fire onto Japanese positions with a speed and accuracy that the Japanese artillery, which was often obsolete and low on ammunition, could not match. The use of concentrated barrages and the systematic walking of artillery fire across the ridgelines was the essential tactical tool that guaranteed the slow, methodical clearance of the unforgiving terrain. The overwhelming firepower was the ultimate counter to the Japanese strategy of attrition and concealed defense. The Japanese defenders, relying on the cover of caves and the rugged terrain, were ultimately neutralized by the sheer volume of high-explosive ordnance that the American forces could continuously deliver. The battle confirmed that a fortified defensive position, no matter how skillfully engineered, is ultimately unsustainable against the continuous application of overwhelming concentrated fire support from a technologically and industrially superior adversary. The legacy of the firepower superiority on Saipan is a profound testament to the lethality of the American war machine. The immense coordinated use of naval and field artillery was the destructive force that transformed the Japanese fortress into a ruin, consuming the enemy garrison strongpoint by strongpoint. The battle confirmed that the final victory in the Pacific was purchased not just by the courage of the infantry, but by the overwhelming, unceasing application of the industrial capacity to deliver concentrated massed fire. The intense, high-cost fighting on Saipan was ultimately won by the psychological edge possessed by the American Marines and soldiers, an edge rooted in superior training, disciplined small unit leadership, and a resilience that allowed them to sustain the continuous pressure of the fanatical Japanese defense. This human factor was the final, decisive element that guaranteed the victory against the deeply entrenched, no-surrender enemy. The foundation of the American psychological edge was the superior, specialized training provided to the Marine Corps and the Army units. The Marines, veterans of the brutal island-hopping campaigns, were trained in the specialized tactics required for amphibious assault, close-quarters combat, and the systematic clearance of fortified positions. This training, emphasizing small unit initiative and rapid adaptation to enemy tactics, ensured that the American forces, even when facing the shock of the banzai charge or the relentless fire from concealed strongpoints, could maintain cohesion and operational effectiveness. The quality of the small unit leadership was equally crucial. Non-commissioned officers and junior officers, operating under immense stress and high casualty rates, were forced to make continuous, life-or-death decisions on the front lines, often leading the direct assault against concealed Japanese positions. Their discipline, courage, and commitment to the mission provided the essential cohesion that allowed the American forces to maintain the pressure and methodically clear the island meter by meter. The high casualty rate among these junior leaders was a tragic testament to their direct, essential role in securing the victory. The final element was the unyielding resilience of the American soldier, the capacity to absorb the immense shock of the initial landing, endure the continuous high-cost attrition of the cave-clearing operations, and repel the fanatical banzai charge. The American soldier, fighting for the swift end of the war and driven by the immense logistical support of the homeland, possessed a psychological stamina that ultimately transcended the fanatical but ultimately futile resistance of the isolated Japanese garrison. The American forces were fighting a costly war of attrition, but they knew they could sustain the losses. The Japanese forces were fighting a war of extermination they could not win. The psychological edge on Saipan confirmed that strategic victory requires not just material superiority, but the superiority of the military system itself. The American system, rooted in professional training, decentralized leadership, and a deep logistical tale, guaranteed that the human factor would ultimately prevail against a desperate, isolated, and strategically doomed adversary. The resilience of the American fighting man was the final, unassailable quality that broke the fanatical Japanese defense. The immense strategic importance of Saipan was confirmed by the strategic foresight of the American planners, who viewed the island not as an end in itself, but as the non-negotiable prerequisite for the final assault on the Japanese home islands. The planning for the capture and rapid exploitation of Saipan was a masterclass in strategic and logistical coordination, designed to accelerate the terminal consumption of the Japanese Empire. The primary element of this foresight was the immediate focus on the B-29 bases. The planning did not merely concern the military conquest, it prioritized the logistical and engineering requirements for the construction of the massive airbases that would house the superfortress fleet. This forward-looking approach guaranteed that the immense logistical tail of the invasion included the necessary Seabee battalions, heavy construction equipment, and specialized material to immediately begin the transformation of the island. The rapid construction of the B-29 Lifeline was not an afterthought. It was the central strategic purpose of the entire campaign. The planning also incorporated the grim, necessary foresight regarding the fanatical Japanese defense. The immense commitment of naval and artillery firepower, coupled with the specialized assault doctrine for cave clearance, was a direct consequence of the intelligence assessments that predicted a no-surrender defense to the last-man resistance. This prepared the American forces for the inevitable high-cost attrition, ensuring that the necessary specialized units and replacement personnel were available to sustain the pressure. The battle was planned not as a quick victory, but as a grinding, methodical clearance operation. The strategic foresight of the Saipan campaign guaranteed that the high cost of the victory was justified by the immense, immediate acceleration of the war's conclusion. By securing the B-29 springboard, the American command placed the Japanese industrial and civilian base under continuous, systematic attack, breaking the final protective barrier. The capture of the Marianas was the single most decisive strategic action that set the stage for the final, total defeat of the Japanese Empire, proving the immense value of strategic planning that looks far beyond the immediate tactical objective. The legacy of the Saipan planning is a testament to the rationality and logistical depth of the American military system. The entire campaign, from the initial landing to the rapid construction of the air bases, was a coordinated, systematic effort to utilize American material and industrial superiority to achieve the final, non-negotiable strategic goal. Saipan was the costly, necessary barrier that, once overcome through superior planning and immense sacrifice, guaranteed the final, inevitable collapse of the Japanese war effort. The successful capture of Saipan was not merely a conquest of territory, it was the decisive moment of strategic isolation, effectively sealing the remaining Japanese empire within an unbreachable logistical and naval perimeter. The victory in the Marianas confirmed that the Japanese command had lost the capacity to project significant power across the vast distances of the Central Pacific, relegating their remaining forces to a desperate, static defense against the inevitable American advance. The strategic situation was now irreversible, marked by the total consumption of Japanese offensive capability. The primary factor in this isolation was the annihilation of the Japanese naval air arm in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The loss of carriers and, crucially, hundreds of trained pilots and aircraft meant that the Japanese fleet could no longer challenge American naval dominance. This secured the vast sea lanes necessary for the continuous, massive flow of American supplies, troops, and materiel required to sustain the final island-hopping campaigns. The strategic isolation was total. The remaining Japanese garrisons, from the Philippines to the home islands, were now cut off from any realistic hope of reinforcement or resupply, facing the daunting logistical power of the American system alone. The strategic isolation was further enforced by the establishment of the B-29 Lifeline. The immense range of the superfortress, operating from the newly constructed Marianas air bases, placed the Japanese industrial heartland under continuous, systematic attack. This strategic air war, sustained by the logistical capacity of Saipan, effectively starved the remaining Japanese military units of the necessary fuel, aircraft, and spare parts required for a cohesive, long-term defense. The strategic perimeter was enforced not just by naval power, but by the relentless industrial application of aerial bombardment. The Japanese strategic response to this isolation was one of profound desperation, the initiation of the decisive battle strategy. Realizing the terminal threat, the Japanese Imperial Command sought to consolidate its remaining forces, committing to a high-cost defense of key islands such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, in a desperate attempt to inflict such catastrophic casualties on the American forces that the political will of the United States would be broken. However, this strategy was fundamentally flawed. The overwhelming logistical and industrial capacity of the American system guaranteed that any losses would be quickly replaced, while the Japanese forces were consuming their last irreplaceable assets. The legacy of Saipan, therefore, is the strategic isolation it imposed upon the Japanese Empire. The island was the key that unlocked the final systematic strangulation of the Japanese war effort, ensuring that the remaining campaigns would be fought under conditions of total American material dominance. The price of the victory was immense, but the strategic payoff was the irreversible momentum toward the final conclusion of the Pacific War. The immense difficulty and high cost of the Saipan campaign were a direct testament to the brilliant engineering and defensive genius of the Japanese garrison. Their defense in depth, utilizing the unique geography of the volcanic island, transformed Saipan into a formidable fortress that successfully defied the standard tactical assumptions of the American invasion doctrine and inflicted maximum attrition on the invading forces. The core of the Japanese defensive genius lay in the masterful use of the cave and tunnel network. Saipan's porous volcanic rock was riddled with natural caves, which the Japanese engineers systematically expanded, reinforced with concrete and steel, and interconnected to form a deep, resilient defensive system. These caves provided perfect sanctuary against the massive American naval and aerial bombardment, allowing the Japanese to emerge and inflict devastating fire on the advancing infantry, only to retreat instantly into the earth. The system forced the Americans into the slow, costly, and inherently dangerous process of systematic cave clearance, neutralizing the American advantages in armor and artillery. The defensive engineering was further amplified by the meticulous placement of concealed and fortified strongpoints. Japanese commanders successfully avoided the temptation of placing their main defenses directly on the beach, which would be immediately pulverized by the naval bombardment, choosing instead to site their key positions on the reverse slopes of the ridgelines and deep inland. This allowed the Japanese defenses to survive the initial assault and emerge to inflict devastating interlocking fire on the advancing Marines and soldiers. The strategic placement of anti-tank guns and heavy machine guns, providing continuous coverage of the beach exits and the valleys, was executed with tactical precision. The Japanese engineers also excelled in the use of anti-amphibious obstacles. The shallow waters and beaches were sown with a complex array of mines, reinforced concrete tetrahedrons, and other underwater obstacles designed to destroy or delay the approaching American landing craft. While the American clearance teams eventually neutralized these threats, the initial chaos and the immense effort required to clear the beaches slowed the landing and compounded the initial casualty rates. The legacy of the Japanese defensive engineering on Saipan is a lasting lesson in the power of fortification and terrain utilization. The immense skill and determination used to transform the volcanic island into a multi-layered fortress ensured that the island was taken only at the highest possible cost, providing a grim, final testament to the defensive ingenuity of the Japanese Imperial Army. The Japanese engineers successfully demonstrated how a technologically inferior force could leverage geography and careful construction to maximize attrition against an overwhelming adversary. The chaotic, brutal aftermath of the final Banzai charge and the subsequent military clearance of the last Japanese strongpoints immediately transitioned into a massive, essential effort: the rebuilding of the logistical hub. The transformation of the shattered battlefield into the immense operational base required for the B-29 fleet. This rapid logistical pivot was the final, non-negotiable step that guaranteed the strategic payoff of the costly victory. The primary task of the Allied engineers and Seabees was one of immense destruction and reconstruction. The battle had left the island littered with the debris of combat, unexploded ordnance, and the wreckage of Japanese and American vehicles. The engineers, working under continuous pressure and the constant threat of localized Japanese holdouts and snipers, rapidly cleared the designated areas for the construction of the massive runways and logistical infrastructure. The challenge was compounded by the intense heat, the continuous threat of tropical disease, and the sheer volume of material that needed to be moved and processed. The engineering effort was characterized by speed and overwhelming resource deployment. Massive construction equipment and specialized materials were continually poured onto the island, transported across thousands of miles of ocean by the unassailable American supply chain. The Seabees utilized specialized techniques to level the rugged terrain, lay down the coral foundation for the immense runways, and construct the vast fuel storage, supply depots, and maintenance hangars necessary for the B-29 fleet. The speed of the construction, achieving operational status within months, was a profound logistical and engineering triumph. The strategic consequences of this rapid rebuilding were immediate. The vast logistical hub created on Saipan and the neighboring islands provided the critical platform for the strategic air war against the Japanese homeland. The immense range of the B-29, operating from these bases, placed the Japanese industrial heartland under continuous systematic attack, accelerating the terminal consumption of their war economy. The speed of the American logistical buildup was a final decisive demonstration of the overwhelming material superiority that guaranteed the swift conclusion of the Pacific War. The legacy of the aftermath of the Banzai is the confirmation that the final phase of the Pacific War was fundamentally a logistical and industrial contest. The immense sacrifice of the Marines in securing the island was the necessary precondition, but the strategic victory was ultimately secured by the engineering ingenuity and the relentless capacity of the American supply system to sustain the massive offensive operations. The rapid reconstruction of the logistical hub on Saipan was the ultimate expression of the American system's power. The intensity and moral complexity of the Saipan campaign left deep, long-term psychological scars on the American forces who fought there, a human legacy that underscored the unique brutality and high cost of the final island-hopping campaigns. The immense physical challenge of the terrain was compounded by the profound moral trauma of fighting an enemy committed to total annihilation and witnessing the tragic mass suicide of the civilian population. The psychological toll was rooted in the unremitting nature of the combat, the continuous close-quarters fighting, the constant threat of the concealed enemy in the caves, and the high rate of casualties placed the American infantry under immense, sustained stress. The lack of a clear front line and the necessity of engaging an enemy who refused to surrender created a war of nerves, leading to high rates of combat fatigue and psychological exhaustion among the surviving troops. The experience of the Banzai Charge, the sight of thousands of desperate, suicidal Japanese soldiers charging the lines, left an indelible mark on the memory of the American soldiers. The greatest psychological scar was the civilian tragedy. The profound shock and moral trauma of witnessing the mass suicides at Suicide Cliff and Banzai Cliff fundamentally impacted the American perception of the enemy and the conflict. The American soldiers committed to a mission of liberation were confronted with the terrifying consequences of the Japanese propaganda machine, forcing them to engage in desperate humanitarian efforts to save civilians who were actively trying to kill themselves. This experience of trying to save the victims of the enemy's own propaganda was a unique moral burden that defied the conventional ethical framework of warfare. The long-term psychological impact of Saipan confirmed the immense human cost of the final Pacific campaigns. The veterans who survived carried the indelible memory of the moral ambiguity, the brutal close-quarters combat, and the unique horrors of fighting an enemy who refused to accept the pathway of surrender. The experience of Saipan became a lasting symbol of the uncompromising brutality of the island war, a profound testament to the psychological endurance of the American fighting man. The legacy of the psychological scars demands that the final victory is never divorced from the immense human cost. The trauma endured by the soldiers on Saipan remains a crucial, somber reminder that the total consumption of the Japanese Empire was purchased at a high, profound personal price, etching the unique brutality of the battle into the collective memory of the conflict. The conclusion of the Battle of Saipan was not merely the end of a battle, it was the beginning of the unfolding future, the immediate realization of the immense strategic foresight that had driven the costly campaign. The island, secured and transformed into a functioning strategic base, immediately began to fulfill its purpose, accelerating the total consumption of the Japanese Empire and setting the stage for the final end of the war. The primary element of this unfolding future was the launch of the Strategic Air War. The B-29 Superfortress fleet, operating from the rapidly constructed Marianas airbases, systematically began the campaign of destruction against the Japanese industrial heartland. The continuous large-scale bombing of industrial targets, coupled with the devastating firebombing of major Japanese cities, consumed the remaining capacity of the Japanese war economy, leading to mass shortages and accelerating the terminal collapse of the regime. The strategic payoff of Saipan was realized in the destruction of the enemy's economic foundation. The second element was the establishment of the final logistical backbone. The immense, resilient supply network centered on the Marianas provided the non-negotiable platform for the subsequent island-hopping campaigns, including Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The logistical capacity of Saipan and its sister islands guaranteed that the American forces could sustain the high-cost, continuous offensive operations required to approach the Japanese home islands, confirming the absolute supremacy of the American supply system. The legacy of Saipan, therefore, is one of strategic consequence and finality. The island was the last major barrier that the Japanese could not afford to lose, and its capture sealed the strategic perimeter around the home islands. The immense human and material cost of the victory was the necessary payment for the ultimate strategic knowledge. The path to the final defeat of the Japanese Empire was now clear, inevitable, and irreversible. The final verdict on Saipan is that it was the single most important strategic acquisition of the Central Pacific Campaign. The island, once a symbol of Japanese defensive depth, was transformed into the decisive launching pad for the total defeat of the Japanese Empire. The strategic foresight of the American planners was confirmed by the immediate devastating realization of the B-29 Lifeline, ensuring that the war was brought to its final conclusion with devastating, overwhelming speed.